series for ethics. In this video, we will continue our discussion of the ethics of Immanuel Kant. And to do so, we should remember a few of the major points that we saw last time. Previously, we saw that Kant conceives of the human being as a very unique being that is both subject to the laws of nature, but also the laws of freedom. We're subject to the laws of nature that govern any physical body in the universe, but we're also, because we have this ability for choice, for reason, because we have a free will, we're also subject to the moral laws of freedom. And if, in fact, Kant is right that what makes us unique in the natural world is that we have this ability for choice and the ability to exercise our will and make decisions, then we might expect that what it means to be a good person, what it means to act well on Kant's view, would be to use our will in an appropriate and proper way. And as we're going to see here, that is precisely what we see Kant arguing, and it's really based on this idea of this famous notion of Kant's, which is known as a good will. And in order to explain the concept of a good will, I want to begin with the following famous passage from the first section of his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. So Kant says, "It is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that can be taken to be good without limitation, except a good will." Now you notice a couple things here. So he's making a claim about what the value of a good will is. And roughly we should just understand the good will to be the proper use of our will, which is our ability to form intentions and act upon them. So we have this ability to say, well, this is what I intend to do, this is what I plan to do, it's the aim or the goal I'm trying to bring about. And that sort of reasoned decision-making process we can either do well or we can do poorly. And so a good will just roughly refers to using our will, using that decision-making process in an appropriate way. And the claim Kant is making here is that there is quite literally nothing more valuable than a good will. Just like with Aristotle, who said the highest good was eudaimonia, just like Mill, who said the highest good was happiness, Kant also begins by the search for a highest good, but he finds it in a good will. And specifically, he says the good will, what he implies here, it has a very specific kind of value. And specifically, it has an unconditional value, or it's an unconditional good. And to explain this idea, we need to distinguish between conditional goods and unconditional goods. So a conditional good is something that's good in certain circumstances or under certain conditions. Maybe it's often good, or maybe it's rarely good, but in those rare circumstances you really need it, right? So a car is good if you need to get around, food is good if you're hungry, friends are good if you're lonely, etc., right? You might say all these are sort of conditional goods. They're good for a specific purpose in a specific circumstance. But he contrasts that with unconditional goods. And these unconditional goods are things that no matter what circumstance you're in, no matter what situation or context you are in, these things will always be valuable, they will always be good. Now, as you might guess, and what he essentially said in that first sentence of section 1, is that the good will has unconditional good. That means it is valuable, your ability to properly and appropriately use your ability to reason and make decisions and form intentions to act. That is good no matter what circumstance you're in. And in fact, what he also says there, because he says it's the goodwill is the only thing that can be good without limitation. This means that the goodwill is the only thing that qualifies as an unconditional good. What we're going to see him say is that everything else that is good has some limit on its goodness. There's some way in which it can be used improperly, or there's some context in which it's not necessary. But being able to use your will properly is always good, and its goodness is unlimited. Okay, so let's see, to further understand this distinction, let's take a look at some examples he gives of things that would fall in the conditional good category. So Kant continues on, he says, understanding, wit, judgment, and whatever else the talents of the mind may be called, or confidence, resolve, and persistency of intent, as qualities of temperament, are no doubt in many respects good and desirable. but they can also be extremely evil and harmful if the will that is to make use of these gifts of nature, and whose distinctive constitution is therefore called character, is not good. It is just the same with gifts of fortune. Power, riches, honor, even health, and the entire well-being and contentment with one's condition, under the name of happiness, inspire confidence and thereby quite overconfidence as well, unless a good will is present to correct and make generally purposive their influence on the mind. So what is he saying here? He says, well, there's many kinds of conditional goods. He mentioned talents of the mind, having understanding or wit, being intelligent, having excellent judgment. All these sort of what we might call mental or intellectual virtues. There's things like qualities of temperament, and here we should think about Aristotle. He's really referring to an idea of a good character trait. Being confident, having resolve, having fortitude, having courage. All these things would be good qualities of your temperament. And then gifts of fortune. Remember back to Aristotle, we talked about this idea of external goods, power, riches, honor, health, well-being, contentment, and happiness, even happiness. All of these things are conditional goods. It doesn't mean they're bad, but it just means there's some way in which they can be used improperly. There's some context or situation in which they're not good. So some of these are rather obvious, and we saw, for instance, Aristotle and Aquinas both pick up on this idea. Power, riches, and honor, and health, these are of course good things for someone who has good plans. But if you're an evil tyrant, if you are a morally corrupt person, then giving you power isn't a good thing. For that person to have power would actually be a bad thing. So we can see how those can't be unconditionally good. What about character traits like courage? Well, you might say courage is good if it leads you to have the strength of character you need to pursue a good goal, to face a corrupt enemy. But if courage just gives you the sort of fortitude and willingness and ability to carry out a criminal plan, then we might say your courage isn't so great. What about talents of the mind, intelligence, understanding, good practical judgment? These are, of course, necessary to live a successful life, but again, the criminal with great intelligence and judgment will just be all the more effective for having those things. So the point he's making here is that any of these conditional goods, we can imagine them being used poorly. Even he says happiness, right? If you are happy and content with your life, you may be more likely to think that you're doing the right thing. It may blind you to the ways in which you're acting in a morally wrong way. So not even happiness, which Mill identified as the sort of fundamental and highest good, not even that can be a good without limit. And I think it's important to notice here how he's not just making a claim about these conditional goods, he's also making a claim here about what has unconditional good. Remember, he says here, all these things can be used poorly unless a good will is present to correct them. So let's just take the easiest example, power, right? So when is power used well and when is it used poorly? Well, we might say, look, it's used well when the person's thought process and their ability to form the right intentions is good, right? If you're the person who intends to bring about good plans, good aims, and good goals, then yeah, we should give you power. It's a good thing for you to have power. But if you're the kind of person who wants to bring about bad plans, bad aims, and bad goals, then it's not good for you to have power. And what does that mean? That means power is only a good thing to the extent that you have a good will. And we could say the same about any of the others: intelligence, courage, money, happiness. These things will only be good if you are the sort of person who is properly using their decision-making abilities, who's properly forming intentions to act. So the reason fundamentally why Kant thinks a good will has unconditional good is because it corrects for all the deficiencies of everything else that's merely a conditional good. And Kant further makes this point in the following passage. He says, moderation in affects and passions, self-control and sober deliberation are not only good in many respects, they even appear to constitute part of the inner worth of a person. So he's saying, look, all these character traits that Aristotle talked about, having self-control, being temperate, being in control of your passions, that's all good, and we think someone who has an excellent character would have those things. But, Kant continues, they are far from deserving to be declared good without limitation, however unconditionally they were praised by the ancients, such as Aristotle. For without the principles of a good will, they can become the most evil. If you are the sort of person who can control your passions and courageously pursue a plan, that doesn't necessarily mean your plan is going to be a morally good one. And I love the way Kant puts it here. He says, the cold blood of a scoundrel makes him not only far more dangerous, but also immediately more loathsome in our eyes than he would have been taken to be without it. We're much more afraid of the criminal mastermind than the blundering criminal. And the criminal mastermind isn't a better criminal, isn't a better person in virtue of having intelligence, judgment, fortitude, and courage. In fact, we would rather that person didn't have those things. So fundamentally, what matters here, what is good without limitation, has to be a good will. And Kant makes another really important claim here about the good will when he says the following. He says, a good will thus appears to constitute the indispensable condition even for the worthiness to be happy. And let's draw a comparison here with Mill. Mill told us happiness was the highest good. Happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain. And he said, all human beings want to be happy. We pursue happiness. We saw this claim in Aristotle, of course, as well. And it is the highest good of our life. What Kant here says is, no, that's not true. Happiness itself is just another conditional good. He's not saying happiness is bad. But at the end of the day, happiness, again, can lead us to do bad things. It can blind us to our own moral inadequacies. And so what's really important in Kant's point of view isn't actually whether you are happy. That's not fundamentally the most important thing. For Kant, what fundamentally is the most important thing is that you are worthy to be happy, that you deserve happiness. And how do you deserve happiness? By having a good will. If you're the sort of person who intends and uses their will to attempt to bring about good aims and good goals and good projects, then even if you don't live a happy life, even if you have bad luck, even if many misfortunes befall you, you still are deserving of happiness. And to that extent, you've done what's most important in a human life. You've become the sort of person who warrants happiness, who's worthy of happiness, whether you actually get to achieve it or not. On the other hand, the person who actually is happy but only did so through morally corrupt means, through lying, stealing, cheating, deceiving, and defrauding people, that person might be happy in the sense of feeling pleasure, having little pain in their life, having many enjoyments, having a lot of joy. That might all be the case, but it's all stolen pleasure. It's all stolen happiness. They don't deserve their status. They don't deserve what they get to enjoy in their life because they have a bad will. So Kant would say, look, you can't control whether you're going to be happy. You can try to a certain extent, but fortune, bad luck, misfortune are all going to play a role in that. What can you control? You can control whether you have a good will. You can control whether you properly form intentions to act or whether you improperly do so. That is fundamentally what's in your control because you're a rational being with reason who can think freely about how you ought to act. And ultimately, that is the highest good for a human life. So suppose we agree with Kant that the good will is the only thing with unconditional value. Suppose we agree that having a good will is the highest good in a human life. We might also ask the question, what is it that makes the good will good? And one answer you might give is, well, having the ability to perform the right intentions to act is good because doing that will most likely produce good consequences. People who attempt as far as they're able to bring about good plans and good projects and good goals, they create good consequences for themselves and others, while those who intend to bring about bad projects, bad goals, and bad plans, they bring about bad consequences for themselves and others. And that's an entirely natural way to think, and of course it's essentially the way that Mill and the utilitarians thought. But in the following passage, we see that Kant rejects this idea. And this passage is one of those which most clearly stakes out the extent to which Kant rejects the utilitarian and consequentialist point of view on ethics. So in this famous passage, Kant says the following. He says a good will is good not because of what it affects or accomplishes, not because of its fitness to attain some intended end, but good just by its willing, i.e. in itself. So if you ask Kant, what is it that makes the good will good? Kant would say, the good will's goodness comes from itself, and not from any consequence that it may or may not attain. When you, for instance, say, okay, I'm going to inform the intention not to tell a lie, right? And I'm going to act on that. I'm going to be honest. Now, Kant would say that's exactly what you should do. That's an example of having a good will, using your reason and your will properly. But if you ask the question, well, why is that good? The answer for Kant is not going to be because that's necessarily going to make other people happy. It's necessarily going to bring about prosperity. No, the reason that's good has nothing to do with the consequences. It's something about that decision, that resolve, that intention in and of itself. It's something about that intention in itself which is good, independent of the consequences at all. And he continues on, he says, even if by some particular disfavor of fate, or by the scanty endowment of a stepmotherly nature, this will should entirely lack the capacity to carry through its purpose. So what is he saying here? Well, imagine that you form the following intention. I'm going to donate to the following effective charities. And let's say that you try your best, you do your research, and you do everything you need to do to make this donation, but something gets messed up, your donation gets stolen by some hacker or something, and it never gets to its intended location. You did everything you could to bring about this good end. So what should we say about your goodwill? Was it no longer good because you weren't successful in what you were trying to achieve? Well, no. Kant says that goodwill would still be good in and of itself. As he continues on, if despite its greatest striving it should still accomplish nothing, and only the goodwill were to remain, then like a jewel it would still shine by itself as something that is full worth in itself. The value of the goodwill comes from itself. It's the very fact that you form the right intention to act. That's what matters from a moral point of view. And that means a good will is still good, whether it produces good consequences, whether it produces neutral consequences and accomplishes nothing, as Kant says, or even whether it produces bad consequences. For instance, if you made that donation, it gets intercepted by a hacking group that goes on to fund a terrorist organization, that means, practically speaking, you donated money which went to fund a terrorist organization. Does that mean your goodwill was no longer good because it helped to produce a bad consequence? Well, no. You formed the right intention to act. You did everything in your power to bring about the good aim. The fact that it didn't work out, that the consequences didn't go the way you wanted to, wasn't your fault, and it was no part of your goodwill. The goodwill has a value all by itself. And so we can see here, this is just absolutely and diametrically opposed to the consequentialist point of view. Morality fundamentally isn't about the consequences of our actions. It's not like the consequences don't matter. Of course, Kant would prefer that good things happen from our will. But the point is that what it means to act morally is to form the right intentions to act. And whatever consequences come from that is simply another matter that we ultimately can't control. Now, when I tell you all of this, a part of you may be thinking this is very strange. So, our will is the ability to think about our actions and form intentions to act, but the goodness of that process doesn't depend upon the consequences of it? That seems very odd, and Kant actually admits this. He says this idea of the absolute worth of a mere will, not taking into account any utility, he says there's something very, very strange about it. And I think he's right about this. I think to the human mind, it's very natural to think in a consequentialist way. A good decision is one that brings about good consequences. A bad decision is one that brings about bad consequences. So Kant owes us a further explanation here. Why is it that the consequences don't matter? How can a will be good in and of itself? And here we're going to get into one of the more technical parts of Kant's philosophy, but the thing I would say is that the reason he ultimately gives for this claim that the goodness of the goodwill does not depend on the consequences has to do with recognizing the implications of the idea that reason is meant to rule our will. He says those who find this idea strange, they may have misunderstood nature's purpose in assigning reason to our will as its ruler. Now this brings up a couple of questions. Well, why should we think that reason is meant to rule our will? What does it mean to say reason rules our will? What is the purpose of that ruling? And we're going to get to that, but before we get there, I just want to coin a term that's going to be useful as we proceed. This idea that reason is meant to rule our will, reason is meant to determine our will or determine our choices, what Kant is referring to here is a phenomenon that I'm going to call practical reason. And all practical reason is the ability to decide how we will act after a process of reasoning. So it's you saying, look, here are the various options I could pursue, here are the various things I could do. I'm going to use my reason and rationality to think about what is the best option. That's all practical reason is. And what Kant is saying here is that our will, our ability to make choices, can be under the influence of two broad general categories. On the one hand, our will can be subject to instinct. As we discussed last time, the choices we make may be determined by a large number of things that are sort of just instinctual that we don't really think about. And again, some of this is just actions that our body might take that are completely non-voluntary. But we can even just think about decisions we feel like we make that are driven by various natural and biological instincts that we have. So we have an instinct to eat, an instinct to sleep, an instinct to procreate, etc., etc. We even have various social instincts, right? So when you see people acting a certain way, there's a certain sort of social pressure that you act that way as well. So we have a whole host of instincts, whether biological and innate, or whether social and cultural and inculcated by our parents and our friends and our family and where we went to school, etc., etc. We have all sorts of instincts. And Kant admits that these instincts can influence our decision making. But what he's saying when we talk about practical reason, and reason being the ruler of our will, is that we also have the ability to have our decision-making process governed and guided by reason. Although we may have an immediate desire to do X, Y, and Z, we may have been trained to do X, Y, and Z, or we may have been brought up to think X, Y, and Z are good things. We have the ability to step back, use our reason, think about what we want to do, and ask the question, is that how we ought to act? And this is really what separates human beings from other animals. Kant may be wrong about this, but in Kant's view, other animals act purely on instinct. There is no reason. They're essentially programmed to act in a certain way, and they carry out that program through their natural and biological instincts. But it is only human beings, right? It is only human beings who, in addition to having instincts, also have reason, and we can reject our instincts, or we can endorse them. If you have an immediate instinct to eat when you're hungry, but you say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to wait till I can eat something healthier and I'm not going to break my diet. You say, I'm going to use my reason to resist that instinct. That is a sort of power that Kant thinks only human beings have. And it works in the moral sphere as well. When you have an immediate desire, inclination, or instinct to tell a lie, or defraud someone in a way that you know can benefit you, Kant thinks we have the ability to use our reason and resist those instincts. So for the moment, what's important here is just to understand that when Kant talks about reason being the ruler of our will, he's just referring to what I will call practical reason, the ability to influence our decisions through our rationality and through our reason. So with these points in place, we can now better understand the argument that Kant gives for why consequentialism is false. And the major claim he's going to make is that if we take seriously the idea that reason is meant to rule our will, then we'll see that judging the will by whether it brings about good consequences or not just doesn't make sense. So to understand this, we're going to go step by step through what I'm going to call the purpose of reason argument that Kant gives in section 1. Okay, so premise 1. Every faculty in a living being is the most fitting or most suitable faculty to achieve the purpose assigned to it by nature. And I'm going to call this the propulsiveness of life principle, and it just comes from the following statement from the Groundwork. Kant tells us, in the natural predispositions of an organized being, one arranged propulsively for life, we assume as a principle that no organ will be found in it for any end that is not also the most fitting for it and the most suitable. So what he means here is just that everything in a living being has a purpose, and the purpose of that thing, of that organ or that ability or that capacity in that being is whatever it's best fitted for. So for instance, the lungs, the purpose of them is to allow us to breathe, and that is the thing, and also the lungs, the idea would be, are the most fitting and the best suited to do that thing. Now, I want to put aside certain issues, right? You might take issue with the idea that there's a sort of purpose to everything in the natural world. You also might take issue with the idea that everything in the natural world is the best designed to achieve its purpose. There's actually a lot of evidence of, it would seem like, poor design or poor features in the human body and other biological bodies to achieve their purpose. But let's put that aside. Kant really doesn't need to make the claim as strong as he makes it here. He could just say, look, everything we find in a biological organism, even if we can imagine something working better, it can't be poorly suited for its purpose. And of course, what Kant is interested in here isn't our feet or our hands or our lungs or our heart, although he would say, based on this, that all of those have purposes. What he's really interested in, what is the purpose of reason? We have this ability to reason. Why do we have it? What is the end or purpose of reason? And whatever that end or purpose of reason is, it must be something that reason is well suited to achieve. That's the idea behind the first premise. Now, the second premise of the argument is just human beings have a faculty, again, of practical reason. And we can see Kant say this a number of times. For instance, he describes the human being as an entity with reason and a will. Okay, so if you put those two premises together, we get the first conclusion that the human faculty of practical reason is the most fitting or most suitable faculty to achieve the purpose assigned to it by nature. So the idea behind this first conclusion would just be that our ability to think about our choices, our ability for practical reason, is the best suited for whatever its purpose is that's assigned to it by nature, whatever its natural purpose is. So that means if we're asking the question, why do we have reason? Whatever answer you give to that question can't be something that reason isn't very good at achieving. And to make this more clear, notice there are two questions we might ask here about this conclusion. Question one, are there any purposes for which practical reason is poorly fitted and poorly suited? So is there anything that you would say, practical reason can do many things, but it is not very good at accomplishing that? And if there is something like that, then that certainly couldn't be the purpose of our reason. And then there's a second question. Once we've eliminated things that we don't think reason is very good at accomplishing, we might also ask, well, what is the natural purpose of our reason? And in the rest of this video, we're going to look at Kant's answer to question one. We're going to see him argue identify something that he doesn't think reason is very good at accomplishing. And in the next video, we'll see in more detail what he thinks the purpose of our reason actually is. So what is something that practical reason isn't well suited to achieve? We get an answer, and what I'm outlining is the third premise of the argument. If the purpose of practical reason was human preservation, prosperity, and happiness, then practical reason would not be the most fitting or most suitable faculty to achieve its purpose. So this premise just says, look, if you're going to say the reason that we have practical reason is so that we can make choices that make people happy, that bring about prosperity, that preserve our lives, if that's what you're saying the purpose of reason is, then if we think about that, we're going to see that reason isn't actually very well suited for that. Reason in Kant's view doesn't necessarily help us to preserve our lives very efficiently or make us prosperous or make us happy. And so the first thing we see, this first question, is there anything reason's poorly suited for? Yes. Preservation, prosperity, and happiness. Kant explains this. If the actual end of nature were its preservation, its prosperity, and in a word, its happiness, then she would have made very bad arrangements. Now, one quick note, preservation, prosperity, and happiness, I think we can sort of file this as the sort of thing that consequentialists are concerned about. Consequentialists say, as a human being, you ought to use your reason to think about how can I make choices and actions that are going to make people happy. So already we see that Kant is telling us our ability to reason is not well suited for that. So the question we should ask, of course, is why? Now, we should also say, well, okay, if reason is not very fitted to bring about preservation, prosperity, and happiness, then what is? Well, as you might guess based on our schema earlier, Kant says if reason really isn't very up to that task in a very efficient way, instinct is. He tells us all the actions that it has to perform with a view to this purpose and the whole rule of its conduct would be marked out for it far more accurately by instinct, and that end would thereby have been obtained much more reliably than can ever be done by reason. So again, remember, our will can be subject to the influence of reason or instinct. And with regard to the outcome of preservation, prosperity, and happiness, Kant's going to say, look, instinct will much better achieve that goal. And we can think of some examples which seem to support this. Look out in nature and look at the animal kingdom. To the extent that animals are allowed to act on their instincts, they don't seem dissatisfied. When a beaver, for instance, builds a dam just purely out of instinct, it doesn't seem bored, it doesn't feel like it's engaging in arduous labor, it's just doing what it was sort of, you might say, destined to do, what it instinctually does. And when it acts in that way, it preserves the species, it brings prosperity to the species, and as far as we can tell, they seem content and satisfied and I guess happy. So Kant says, well, look, if our purpose in life was to be happy, if our purpose in life through our reason was to achieve prosperity, then why wouldn't we just act on instinct? Why wouldn't we be like the beavers who build the dam? Why wouldn't we be like any other animal that does what it does merely based on instinct? But of course we do have instinct, but we don't just have that, we also have reason. And so if the goal of preservation, prosperity, and happiness could have been better achieved by instinct, then we're left wondering, why do we have reason in the first place? And of course, for Kant, it's not just that reason isn't the best way of achieving happiness. It's not just that instinct does it better. It's that reason actually does a poor job. And one of the most interesting passages from the Groundwork, I think, Kant tells us, in actual fact, we do find that the more a cultivated reason engages with the purpose of enjoying life and with happiness, so much the further does a human being stray from true contentment. So those who engage in reason the most, those who use their rational faculty the most, are often the least happy. He says these people develop a sort of misology or a hatred of reason, and that they ultimately look down with a sort of envy on what he calls the more common run of people who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct and who do not allow their reason much influence on their behavior. So he says, if you want to find the people who are happiest, look at those who use reason the least. Look at those who just have a plan of life marked out for them by their community. Look at those who don't have to think about what they will do with their lives. Look to those who have the security of knowing they have a certain plan and can just carry it out. And I think what Kant's getting here is, if you think about what reason causes when we think about our actions to a high degree, often it can cause anxiety and uncertainty. When we're not just following a preset plan and we have to think for ourselves what to do, then you start having thoughts like, well, am I truly acting correctly? Am I reasoning correctly? How do I know this is the proper plan? And that can all bring about these thoughts of uncertainty, a sort of mental disturbance and anxiety that doesn't come when you're just following tradition and following instinct. To take a mundane example, I think the best example of this can really be found when you go to the grocery store, and for instance, if you're looking to buy cereal or maybe buy shampoo, and you go in the aisle and you look around, and there are just brand after brand after brand after brand, and you say to yourself, I could spend maybe the rest of the afternoon looking at all these, researching these, worrying if I'm really choosing the right one, right? Am I spending my money most efficiently? Or you can do what most people do. You can develop a brand loyalty and continue using that brand for your entire life. And why do we do that? What is the advantage of it? We don't have to spend the time thinking about what we're doing. We don't have to become anxious and worry about whether we're taking the right path. So Kant isn't ever saying that our use of reason doesn't make us happy. It has brought about a lot of developments to civilization and modern medicine, etc., etc. But he's just saying that there's a real way in which the constant examination of our actions by reason is not the best way to become happy. Another way to put it, living an examined life is not necessarily a happy life. Now, does this mean that Kant thinks that we shouldn't use our reason to guide our actions? No, in fact, it doesn't. In fact, he thinks to live a true life as a human, as a person, requires subjecting our actions to reason. He's just telling you it's not necessarily going to make you happy. And of course we should expect this given what he already said by saying happiness isn't what's most important, it's the worthiness to be happy that truly matters. So if we put all these points together, we get the final conclusion of the argument. The purpose of the human faculty of practical reason is not the human's preservation, prosperity, and happiness. And another way to put this is, the purpose of our reason is not to bring about beneficial consequences for ourselves and the rest of the human species. We have this ability of practical reason, and it does have a purpose. But that purpose cannot necessarily be to bring about good and desirable consequences, because acting on instinct would do that just as good or better. And if we think that reason has some unique purpose, then it can't be a purpose that instinct or something else would be more efficient at achieving. So therefore, this is why Kant tells us the good will shines all by itself and has its value completely and entirely in itself. And as such, this is how Kant rejects the consequentialist view of ethics. Now, of course, there still is the question of what is the purpose of reason, not just what isn't it, what is its purpose is not. But we're going to look at that in the next video. So I will stop here. Thank you for listening. I will see you next time.